The Z-44 is, in my opinion, a solidly mediocre ship, and I suspect that some people will call it trash, but I wouldn't go that far. The game you're about to see should perfectly demonstrate to you that the Z-44 certainly has the potential to deal a respectable amount of damage, and we will deal a respectable amount of damage in this game. But the Z-44 might not be as good as some of the alternative choices for destroyers at Tier 8 when it comes to actually winning the games. And we'll talk about why once we start fighting the enemy destroyers, because I think that is crucial to the reason. But also, in this game, I was running this build on blue. But I think I'll actually be running Von Spee in the future with this build. I'm not going to get bogged down right now in talking about why, but as you can see, minus the base traits, the two commanders offer essentially the same build with slightly different unique skills. And the stats I'm about to give you are going to be influenced by the blue build, because that's what I was running at the time, although I would recommend Von Spee for this particular destroyer. Anyway, let's get into it, run down the stats, and then we'll talk about how the ship plays. So, to begin with, we've got 19,400 HP. And that's not terrible, of course. That's a high amount for a destroyer, but I think relative to the other destroyers at Tier 8, it's probably not all that much. And I think that is because primarily the Z-44 is a torpedo-focused destroyer, much like the typical IJN destroyer. Obviously, it's different, but the main armament here is the torpedoes and certainly not the guns. Take a look, we are spotted, and the culprit is the enemy Shimakaze. We're going to shoot at him before he goes dark, and we do manage to hit him with 3 shells for 3 full pens. We do a grand total of 1,106 damage, which for 3 shells, doing 3 full HE pens on a destroyer, well, it seems kind of low to me, and hopefully it seems kind of low to you. The reason it seems kind of low is because it is. The Z-44 shares a common trait with other German ships. Most ships in this game, if you want to figure out the armor that a particular high explosive shell can penetrate, you take the high explosive shell in millimeters and divide by 6. The answer is the armor threshold that the HE shell can penetrate. But for the Germans, you typically take that HE shell and you divide it by 4. This is what's known as quarter caliber pen. So the Germans typically get quarter caliber pen on their destroyers, and I think that is true of the Z-44. As a consequence, their HE can penetrate more armor than a typical destroyer with the same sized guns, but at the same time, the maximum damage that the HE shells do is low. It's only 1,500 for the Z-44 on the high explosive shells. That is not great. And it's only got a 6% fire chance, which is also not great. The guns reload in 4.5 seconds, which is reasonable at the very least, but with that kind of fire chance and that kind of HE alpha, they're not all that good. They also have a 180-degree turn time of 20 seconds, which makes them, well, quite slow, more in line with the French or the Russian destroyers. The AP, however, is fantastic. It's got a maximum damage of 3,000, so in fact, when you're shooting at enemy destroyers, it is often better to shoot them with the AP, because when you do get the full penetrations on the AP, it does a lot more damage than the HE, and even if you don't, the overpen damage is, I think, sufficient. Or at least it's in line with the damage that the HE actually does. But the main armament here, as we've said, is the torpedoes. We've managed to land 1 torp, but we'll land more as this game continues. The torpedoes here are the real highlight, and they are quite different from the typical German destroyer torpedoes. First of all, there are 10 of them. They're set in 2 quintuple launchers in the middle of the ship that can launch off either side. The reload with the build that I have that includes blue skills for buffed torpedo reload and the torpedo reload mod, I've got these things back in the tubes in 57 seconds. That's just under a minute. So practically every minute, 15 times during the course of the game, you can launch these torpedoes out. They have a 12-kilometer range, which is quite nice, and they go at 72 knots, which is very fast. They also have a 1.3-kilometer detectability by sea, so that, coupled with the speed and the distance, means they're stealthy torpedoes, and they're not going to be the easiest to dodge. They don't do the most damage in the world when they actually make contact, though. They've got a maximum damage of 14,400. I'd say that's respectable, but it's not great compared to, say, the IJN destroyers or even the French ones. But, the damage can be done with these torpedoes, and they do seem to have a good chance to cause flooding. In fact, we've got a permanent flood going on that Yamato. And you might think to yourself, because if you look at this game, the vast majority of the damage we get is going to come from that permanent flood and another permanent flood. So you might think to yourself that, well, you're not going to be getting perma-floods very often on this thing, so this game isn't necessarily representative of the damage output that the Z-44 can achieve. You might be correct about that. I don't know. The fact that I got 2 perma-floods in this game suggests to me that the flooding chance on this particular destroyer is pretty good, and the fact that these torpedoes can reload in less than a minute means you could send them out every 60 seconds or less at battleships that have used their DCP, and you can probably pretty regularly and reliably get permanent floods if you do it right, provided your positioning is good, your team is cooperating, and all that stuff. But anyway, more on the stats. It does have anti-aircraft guns. It's got not many of them, though. Well, actually, it's got 7x4 30mm guns, but they do a pathetic 100 average damage per second, and they have a 3 km range. This thing basically doesn't have any AA. Maneuverability, on the other hand, pretty good. 38 knot top speed, pretty run-of-the-mill as far as destroyers go, but a nice 670 meter turning circle and a responsive 4.4 second rudder shift. Not too bad at all. Concealment, I've got it down to 5.4 kilometers, which is respectable for a torpedo boat of this kind. But overall, I think the ship is mediocre. Certainly these torpedoes can do the damage, and certainly you can sling them out every 60 seconds, which increases your chances of hitting. Although, to be fair, we've gone halfway through this game and landed only 4 torpedoes. I tend to think that destroyers with torpedoes as their main armament, the way this one is, are not quite as effective as destroyers that have better guns. And the reason for that is because torpedoes, in comparison to actual guns, are not reliable. They're more subject to RNG, and they're much easier for the enemy ships to counter. If you're shooting at an enemy ship with, any other ship, whether you're shooting HE or AP, the ways to counter are clear. If it's HE, really the best thing to do is to kite and make it difficult for the enemy to land the HE shells on you and then turn around when you get the chance, reposition, and go in fresh. With AP, the answer is simple. Simply angle. But with torpedoes, well, just take a look at this particular scenario where we've got an enemy Yamato 9.2 kilometers away. Looks like he is straightening out and starting to go in a straight line, so we launched the torpedoes essentially on the indicator, predicting that he will continue straight on his course. Hopefully he maybe doesn't realize that the Z-44 has such a quick reload. And we think, well, that guy is dead. But here's the problem. At the point where we launched the torpedoes, there were about 34 seconds for them to reach the target, and they had about 7.4 kilometers to traverse through the water before they actually get to the Yamato. That 34 seconds and that 7.4 kilometers is a lot of time and a lot of distance. All the Yamato really has to do is change his speed and his course, and if he doesn't avoid the torpedoes entirely, he can at least avoid the vast majority of the damage. And that's the problem with torpedoes. Yes, they can hit for a lot of damage, and they can do things like cause permanent flooding, but as a reliable source of dealing damage, they are not optimal on really any ship, and this is true also of the dedicated IJN torpedo boats like the Shimakaze. A lot of people think that destroyer is just fantastic and great because of the torpedo power. And sure, it's got great torpedo power. Maybe not compared to this thing. The Z-44 has, I think, pretty good torpedo power, but it's no Shimakaze. But both of them suffer from the same problem, which is that torpedoes have to travel in a straight line for a long distance before they actually reach the target. They can spread out. RNG affects the dispersion of torpedoes in the same way it does the dispersion of main guns. RNG is the thing that causes battleship-sized gaps to develop between two torps and allow battleships to just slip through. So RNG is subject to a lot, or torpedoes rather, are subject to a lot of RNG, and that makes them less reliable than guns. Guns have a very short amount of time between leaving the barrel and hitting the target, and aiming them is much more reliable. So if you want a destroyer that's really good at winning games, you've got to get a destroyer that has very good guns, and the Z-44 simply doesn't. There are 5 of the guns, they are 128 millimeters, but the HE damage is pathetic, although the HE pen is pretty good. The fire chance is not great, the AP is okay, but this is really not a gunboat that can easily fight other enemy destroyers. It's going to be outgunned all the time. And it doesn't even have sort of the redeeming features of the Shimakaze, where, while the guns on that are pretty terrible, at least the HE hits pretty hard when it does hit. The same is not true of the Z-44. So because of the lack of guns, or the lack of gun power rather, and the primary focus of torpedoes as the main armament, I think the ship is pretty run-of-the-mill. I'm not going to call it bad. I mean, obviously we've done 150,000 damage in this game with primarily these torpedoes. We've even got the Witherer medal, which seems kind of peculiar to me, considering we started at 0 fires this game, but maybe the Witherer medal is also based on flooding. It must be in order for us to have gotten it. I don't actually know. In any case, I think this destroyer is perfectly skippable. There were a lot of ships released in this most recent update, and the Z-44 is of course the reward for the ongoing campaign. But we've also got 3 free Bureau projects that really only cost time to complete, although you do have to have the Tier 6, Tier 7, and Tier 8 ships and win a game in those in the corresponding line for all 3 of them. They are, of course, the Holland, the Henri the Fourth, and the Colombo. And plus, we've got the return of P-Bag for Global XP, and soon the debut of Maya as a Tier 6 Premium IJN Cruiser. All of those ships are better and more desirable than this one, in my opinion. So if you're going to pursue any of the 3 legendaries, or the P-Bag, or even buy the Maya from the store, I think you're going to be getting a better experience than you would if you complete the campaign for the Z-44. That's not saying you shouldn't do it. Of course, you do get nice rewards for going up the campaign, and it's not like having this ship in your port is going to hurt you, and who knows, maybe someday later it'll come back and be useful as a thing you need to complete a Bureau project or something like that. And a lot of people really enjoy boats that are primarily focused on torpedoes. Those kind of players probably will enjoy this destroyer to some degree. It's no Shimakaze, and it's certainly not trash. It's just, in my opinion, mediocre and nothing special. You know what is special, though, is the Napoli on the enemy team in this game. He's the last guy left alive, and he has been for quite some time. He was facing off against 4 of us, and we're very close on points. I've managed to flip all 3 of the rings, so maybe we could win on points before this game ends, but spoiler alert, we're not going to. You can see the shells traveling toward the Napoli from the other side of the screen. Those are from the Tulsa, who's got no HP. Napoli's gonna hit him, take him out. The moment he does, the score was 577 to 669. It then went down to 527 to 704 in the enemy's favor. At the end of this game, the enemy is going to beat us 590 to 704. A lot of you might be thinking the Tulsa through there, and that's what I was initially thinking too, so I went and did the math. We lost 50 points when the Tulsa sunk. And in between the time the Tulsa sunk and the time this game ends, we gained 63 points, which we still would have done if the Tulsa had lived. And remember, if the Tulsa had lived, the enemy would have been stuck at 669. When the Tulsa went down, we had 577. Add 63 to that, answer is 640. Few points below what we would have actually needed to win. So maybe not the biggest throw on the Tulsa's part, or at least not as much of a throw as it looked like. So don't go bashing the guy too hard. Z-44, on the other hand, I say it's hit or miss. Let me know what you think in the comments, but I think it's pretty mediocre. Hope you enjoyed the video. If so, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.